Imagine you ask for a raise, your boss says no, and then the king steps in and says, if you take higher pay, you are breaking the law. That is not a metaphor. After the Black ripped through Europe, governments really tried to freeze wages in place, because too many workers were dead, and the survivors suddenly held the one thing nobody could print, seize, or pray into existence: living hands. And here's the twist I want you to hold on to before we explain anything else. This disaster did not just people, it flipped the core problem of the economy. For centuries, land had been the bottleneck. Overnight, labor became the bottleneck. That swap quietly rewrote what work meant, what fair pay meant, who could walk away, and who had to beg. Stay with me, because in a few minutes you are going to see a medieval version of a modern workplace fight. Employers panicking, lawmakers threatening, workers moving anyway, and a new class of people being born almost by accident. Not because anyone invented the middle class, but because the payroll math forced a new deal. To feel how shocking this was, you have to start in the world right before the plague, when the economy is not built around paychecks, it is built around locks. A village is a machine. It runs on custom. You do not clock in for wages the way we think of it. You owe things. You owe days of labor on the Lord's own fields. You owe a share of your harvest. You owe little fees at weddings, inheritances, and holidays. You owe permission to move. You owe obedience to rules you didn't vote on and cannot easily escape, because the whole system assumes there will always be enough people to replace you. If you are a landowner, your confidence comes from replacement. If one worker gets difficult, you find another. And because most people live close to the edge, the fear of falling off that edge keeps them compliant. It is stable in the way a closed fist is stable. Then a ship docks or a caravan arrives, and the closed fist opens by force. The plague reaches Europe in late 1347, and then explodes in 1348, and when it arrives, it does not negotiate, it does not care about titles, and it does not care what the rent was supposed to be. Picture a town street where the noise fades week by week, the bakery shuttered, the workshop dark, the market smaller each morning. In the countryside, it is worse, because the land does not stop needing attention just because people are dying. A field does not care if you are mourning. It still needs seed. A herd still needs watching. A roof still needs repair. And when those tasks do not get done, the economy does not just slow down, it breaks in visible ways. Grain rots, tools sit unused, animals wander, and the people who survive do not just survive disease. They survive the sudden absence of the people who made their world function. Here is a small scene that tells the whole story without charts. Imagine a steward, basically the manager of a lord's estate, walking the edge of a field in spring, staring at soil that should be busy with planting. In the old world, he would call the tenants for their owed labor, and they would show up, maybe grumbling, but they would show up. Now he calls, and fewer bodies appear. Some are sick, some are burying family, some are simply gone, and the ones who do appear stand differently. They have watched neighbors. They have watched priests run out of prayers. They have watched the normal order fail. And now, they are hearing rumors that on the next estate over, someone is paying extra just to get the work done. That steward can threaten fines and punishment. But here is the reality he is staring at. Punishment does not harvest wheat. The Lord still owns the land, but ownership is suddenly less powerful than it looks, because land without labor is just scenery. This is the payroll problem, flipping in real time. Before the plague, the question was, how do we control land? After the plague, the urgent question became, how do we get workers, and what will they demand? You can tell how fast the flip happened by how fast the people in charge reached for laws. In England, within a year of the first wave, the Ordinance of Labourers comes in 1349, and then the Statute of Labourers follows in 1351. It is one of the clearest tell moments in economic history, because the law is basically a confession. It says wages must not rise above pre-plague levels. It says workers should accept work when offered. It tries to stop people from shopping their labor around. In plain terms, the state tried to bend raises. If you are watching this and you are thinking, no way that could work, good, because the failure is the point, and the failure is where the story gets interesting. But before we get to the failure, sit on the fact that elites were frightened enough by worker leverage to criminalize higher pay. That is a rare moment where a whole society admits, out loud, that the balance of power is shifting. If you like this kind of story where a medieval law reads like a modern workplace email written in panic, subscribe to Stay Financial Historian, because we chase the money trail through the drama, not through dusty slogans, and you will start spotting these patterns everywhere once you have seen them once. Now watch what happens next, because this is where most history summaries get lazy. They say, wages rose, and move on. But what does wages rose actually look like in a village with fear in the air and a king telling you not to take more pay? It looks like arguments in manor courts. It looks like whispered deals. It looks like people testing boundaries. Imagine a strong young reaper, let's call him Thomas, who used to take whatever rate was offered during harvest. Now, Thomas knows the harvest cannot wait, and he knows there are fewer men like him left. The steward offers the old wage. Thomas says no. The steward threatens him with the law. Thomas walks anyway, because he has heard another estate will feed him better and pay him more. The steward drags him into the manor court, because the court is the old system's way of pulling people back into line. And maybe Thomas gets fined. Maybe he gets threatened. But then the steward has to go home and solve the original problem. The crop still needs cutting. The law can create a paper victory and a real loss. So a lot of compliance becomes theater. Official wages stay flat in the records, but real compensation sneaks upward in ways harder to regulate. Extra food, better lodging, a gift at the end of the season, lighter obligations next year, a quiet promise that a son will inherit a better strip of land. This is how markets move when authorities try to pin them down. The price does not only show up as a number, it shows up as terms, and the terms are what create a new kind of life. Here is the next pivot, and it is the one that matters more than a single raise. The relationship between people and land starts converting from obligation into contracts. In the old model, a tenant owes labor days, which is great for a lord when labor is plentiful, because it is basically free staffing. But when labor is scarce and unreliable, forced labor becomes a management headache. You have to enforce it. You have to supervise it. You have to chase people who do not show up. So landlords begin commuting those labor dues into cash payments, meaning you swap 3 days of work for this amount of money. That sounds technical, but the human effect is simple. Money is portable. Money can be saved. Money can be used to leave. And once leaving is possible, staying has to be earned. That is the seed of bargaining power. You can feel it in small household choices. A family that used to survive on the edge can now eat slightly better, not because the world is kinder, but because their labor is harder to replace. And once you get a little margin, you can make moves that were impossible before. You can buy a tool. You can pay a fee. You can apprentice a child. You can survive a bad season without selling everything. This is what middle class starts as, not an identity, not a vibe, but a thin layer of financial breathing room that sits between noble and desperate. Let me ground that in a scene that could have happened 1,000 ways and did happen in court records and estate accounts. Imagine a widow named Alice. Her husband is dead. Before the plague, that could mean disaster, because the household still owes its services, and a lone widow is easy to pressure. After the plague, the pressure does not vanish, but the leverage landscape is different. Alice's cottage is not just a cottage. It is a unit of production on a lord's land. If Alice leaves, that cottage might sit empty. Empty cottages do not pay rent, do not produce crops, and do not reinforce the lord's status. So Alice goes to negotiate. Maybe she says, I cannot do the labor days the old way, but I can pay money rent if you let me. Or she says, reduce what I owe, and I will stay. Or she asks for her terms in writing, because she does not trust that a verbal promise will hold when a new steward arrives. The lord does not like being negotiated with, but the lord also knows the neighboring estate is making offers. Scarcity turns pride into compromise, and once Alice gets even a small concession, the concession becomes news. Villages talk. People compare. The idea of a fixed, sacred obligation starts to weaken, not because anyone reads a philosophy book, but because the math makes flexibility worth more than strictness. Now, here's the tension that keeps this story from becoming a feel-good. Wages saved the day fantasy. Every time workers gain leverage, institutions push back. England's wage cap laws are one pushback. Local enforcement is another. Moral pressure is another. You start hearing talk about idle people wandering, about workers being greedy, about the old order needing protection. That moral language is not random. It is a way to frame a pay dispute as a virtue dispute. If you can convince society that asking for more pay is sinful, you do not have to admit you are losing bargaining power, but the moral framing has a problem. It does not plant fields. And as the years go on, a new routine forms. Landlords adapt where they can. Some lease land out for cash instead of managing it directly. Some reduce services to keep tenants. Some shift production toward things that need fewer hands. And workers, meanwhile, adapt too. They move more. They renegotiate more. They marry differently. They delay marriage in some places, because higher wages and better prospects change household formation. They consume differently. Diets can improve in pockets, because fewer people chasing the same food can mean better access for survivors, at least for a time. And in towns, the effects are sharp in a different way. In a city workshop, if the master and a few skilled hands with him, the latter changes overnight. Apprentices can rise faster. Journeymen can demand more. Guilds can tighten rules to protect what scarcity gives them. You get a strange mix of opportunity and control. Scarcity can empower workers, but it can also empower insiders who know how to gatekeep. That is another modern mirror, and we will come back to it later. First, I want you to see the moment when the new leverage turns into open conflict. Because societies do not love renegotiation. They tolerate it until it threatens the people with the most to lose. In England, by the time you reach 1381, decades after the first wave, the country has been squeezed by more than just labor issues. There are taxes tied to war costs. There is resentment over who pays and who decides. There is anger at officials who enforce rules that feel one-sided. And then you get the peasants' revolt, and it is messy and complicated, and not a single issue, wage revolt. But the background heat is the same heat you felt in Thomas refusing a wage and Alice negotiating her rent. People who have seen the powerful bend do not forget it. Even if the revolt is suppressed, the pressure it represents doesn't disappear. Over time, forced serf-like restrictions weaken in many parts of England, not in a clean straight line, but in a slow erosion, because enforcement is costly and the economy is more cash-based now, more mobile, more contractual. A lord can insist on old obligations, but if tenants keep leaving and land keeps going idle, the insistence becomes self-harm. Now watch the countryside change in a way that feels almost like a business pivot. When labor is expensive, you either pay it, reduce your need for it, or find a way to bind it. One response was leasing. Take a steady cash rent and let tenants manage production, which shifts risk downward, but also reduces the landlord's management burden. Another response was changing what the land is used for. Grain is labor hungry. Pasture, especially sheep, can be run with fewer people. Wool also plugs into cash trade networks. So in some places you see landowners moving toward sheep and wool, and that has knock-on effects. Fewer laborers needed more cash income, more emphasis on trade, and later more conflict over land use because pasture can mean enclosing land that used to be worked by many households. You can feel the tension building in those choices, because one person's efficient use of land is another person's loss of livelihood. This is not a moral story with heroes and villains carved in stone. It is a power story. People respond to incentives. Workers respond to scarcity by demanding more. Landowners respond to higher labor costs by changing production and tightening control where they can. Governments respond to instability by trying to freeze the world in place. The plague did not create human nature. It just turned the volume up so loudly you cannot pretend you do not hear it. Now here is a twist that keeps the story honest, and also keeps it interesting. Europe does not move as one unit. In parts of Western Europe, especially places with strong towns and more fragmented power, workers gain ground over time and labor obligations weaken. In parts of Eastern Europe, landowners later managed to tighten the grip, binding peasants more firmly to estates in what historians sometimes call a second serfdom, which is just a way of saying the leash gets shorter, not longer. Same basic demographic shock, different outcomes, because the outcome depends on who can write and enforce the rules. Scarcity matters, but enforcement matters too. If local elites can coordinate and the state supports their control, workers can be trapped even when they are scarce. If enforcement is weaker and exit is easier, bargaining spreads. This is why two modern labor markets can face the same disruption and still end up with different realities. The rules decide whether leverage becomes freedom or just becomes a reason for someone to build a better cage. Now, let's zoom in again, because the big patterns only matter if you can feel them at human scale. Picture a young man named Martin in the 1360s. Before the plague, Martin's path is mostly written. He will likely work where his family works. He will likely inherit little. He will likely owe the same services his father owed. After the plague, Martin hears something new in the air. Options. A nearby town is short on skilled hands. A monastery is leasing land because it cannot staff it. A landlord across the river is offering lighter dues to attract tenants. Martin's decision is not framed as career strategy the way we would say it, but the behavior starts to resemble it. He weighs travel. He weighs risk. He weighs the anger of local officials against the promise of better terms. This is the moment work starts to separate from place. Not completely, not evenly, but enough to matter. And once enough people act this way, the economy needs more money in circulation, more contracts, more record keeping. The same authorities trying to control labor also end up building administrative tools that make the economy more transactional. It is one of history's quiet jokes, the attempt to freeze wages. And movement can push a society toward more paperwork, more centralized enforcement, and more modern governance, even as leaders claim they are defending tradition. Another quiet joke is how survival reshuffles assets. When death hits at that scale, inheritances move. Tools, leases, land use rights, shops, animals, assets do not vanish. They get redistributed among survivors, and that redistribution can give some households a launchpad. Not everyone benefits. Plenty of people are crushed by grief, debt, and opportunists, but enough people inherit something that you get a noticeable group with both higher labor income and some assets. That combination is explosive, because income pays for life, but assets create resilience and growth. If you can buy a better plow, you produce more. If you can afford an extra animal, you expand. If you can pay an entry fee, you join a town as a freeman. If you can fund an apprenticeship, your child moves into a trade. Again, this is not a fairy tale. It is a narrow path through a brutal landscape. But that narrow path is how middle layers of society form. Now, I want to return to the wage cap laws for one more beat, because this is where the modern lesson hides. The state tried to stop wages from rising. It tried to stop workers from moving. It tried to stop employers from competing. In other words, it tried to legislate away scarcity. That effort is the medieval version of any system today trying to insist the old deal still applies after the world has changed. And the reason it is worth studying is not because we expect kings to cap wages again in the same way, but because the instinct is the same. When institutions feel the cost of labor rising, they often try to reduce worker leverage by controlling movement, information, and alternatives. In medieval England, that meant laws about where you could work and what you could be paid. In modern life, it can mean non-competes, restrictive scheduling, credential barriers, or just policies designed to make quitting harder. The point is not that everything is the same. The point is that leverage always triggers counter-leverage. And the Black Death is one of the cleanest moments in history, where you can watch that dance play out in fast motion. Now watch the psychological shift, because it is subtle but powerful, and it helps explain why the old system never fully snaps back. When death becomes common, the idea that the world is fixed becomes harder to believe. People who survive something like that carry a different sense of time. Some spend more, Some take risks. Some become religious in new ways. Some become cynical. But across society, you get a loosening of the argument because it has always been this way. And once that argument weakens, negotiation becomes thinkable. That is why you see more written agreements, more disputes that sound like bargain, more movement, more friction between local custom and individual choice. It is not that medieval people suddenly become modern Americans. It is that the edge of possibility expands. An expanded possibility is exactly what creates a middle layer of society. Because a middle layer is where people can make choices that are not just survival reactions. Now, before we jump to modern parallels, let's do one more concrete run through the cause and effect chain in plain terms, because it is easy to get lost in the drama. When the plague kills a huge share of workers, the remaining workers can demand better terms. When workers demand better terms, elites try to cap wages and control movement. When control is costly and incomplete, real compensation rises anyway through side deals and renegotiations. As cash payments spread, people gain portability and options. As options spread, bargaining becomes normal. As bargaining becomes normal, the economy shifts toward contracts, wages, leasing, and production choices that respond to labor costs. That is the payroll problem flipping. Land is still valuable, but it is no longer the only lever. The ability to attract and keep labor becomes the new lever. And once that lever exists, the people who hold it start slowly to look like a new social category: workers with leverage, skills, and cash, who are not nobles, but are also not locked in place the way their grandparents were. Now, let's make the modern parallel sharp and brief, instead of turning it into a second video. Think about the Great Resignation and the remote work fight. In many industries, COVID did not destroy half the workforce, but it did scramble the labor market. People retired early. People changed priorities. Childcare collapsed. Certain jobs became visibly miserable. And for a while, employers faced a question that sounded medieval in spirit: how do we get people to show up, and what will they demand? That is when you saw pay bumps, signing bonuses, flexible schedules, and remote work suddenly declared possible after years of being declared impossible. The clearest line from that era is still this: we cannot find workers often means we cannot find workers at the old price. That line is not cynical, it is just honest. And just like in the 1350s, once the shock eased, you saw a push to restore old terms, return to office rules, tighter hiring, a new tone about discipline and normal. Same pattern: when labor gets leverage, terms improve. When leverage shifts back, institutions try to lock the deal again. The medieval world did it with wage caps. The modern world does it with policy, culture, and control over where work happens. If you only remember one practical lesson from this story, remember this: every work contract is a negotiation, even when it pretends it is not. And the pretenses get ripped away fastest during shocks. Now, I want to ask you a question that is easy to answer and hard to stop thinking about. If you were alive in 1351 and the law said you could not take higher wages, would you risk breaking the rule to get paid more? Or would you keep your head down and accept the old rate? Comment, risk it, or play it safe, and give me your reason in one sentence, because your answer says a lot about how you view leverage, fear, and fairness when the rules feel one-sided. And if you know someone right now arguing about a raise, switching jobs, or fighting their boss over remote work, share this with them in one tap. Because it is easier to negotiate when you realize the tug-of-war over pay is not new. It is ancient, and it always intensifies when the world changes faster than the rulebook. Now, let's land this story with the final image. Because the Black Death is so huge, it can become abstract. And I do not want abstract. I want you to see the moment of transformation. Picture that same field from earlier, the one the steward was staring at in spring. A generation later, the field is still there, but the relationships around it have shifted. More payments are in cash. More labor is hired, not owed. More tenants have written terms. More young people leave their birthplace because they can. More landlords run estates like revenue projects instead of pure status machines. Towns pull more people in, trade thickens, and in that world, a person who sells labor is no longer automatically a permanent subordinate, not free in the modern sense, not equal, safe from exploitation, but no longer invisible. The plague forced society to price labor more honestly, because society had no choice. That honesty was born from horror, and it came with backlash and conflict, but it also cracked open something that never fully closed again. The idea that work terms can change. That is why the Black Death is not just a grim chapter of disease. It is one of the clearest demonstrations that the way it has always been is often just the way it has been under a specific set of scarcities. Change the scarcity, and the deal has to change. So here is the reflection I will leave you with, and it is not a goodbye, it is a challenge. Pay attention to the gaps in your own era, the gap between what you were told you were worth, and what the world is forced to offer when it cannot function without you. The gap between rules on paper and deals in practice. The gap between tradition and what scarcity demands, because those gaps are where new classes are born, new contracts are written, and new fights begin. And if you keep watching those gaps, you will start seeing the next payroll flip coming before it is obvious to everyone else.